I chose to do my project on the Latinx civil rights movement. So, for some background, the Mexican American War ended with a treaty that granted 55% of Mexico's land to the US. And this meant that some Mexicans chose to stay in US territory, which created a large Mexican American population. During World War II, there were labor shortages in the agricultural industry that needed to be filled in order to feed the country and create exports for the US. So, in response to this labor shortage, the Bracero program was created between the US and Mexico, which allowed millions of Mexican men, to work on temporary agricultural contracts in the US. Unfortunately, these men and other Latinx farm workers were overworked and exploited by the farm owners. Latinx people endured many struggles during the Latinx civil rights movement. One struggle that they faced was unethical working conditions, and they were paid very low wages. In 1965, most grape pickers made 90 cents an hour, and farm owners ignored the state laws that regulated working standards. So, for example, there were no bathrooms available on the fields, and farm workers were not protected from the pesticides. Um, these farm workers often lived in nearby communities and their housing was owned by the farms. However, their housing was segregated by race. It was often unheated, and they didn't have cooking facilities or plumbing, and oftentimes they were infested with mosquitoes and other insects. The average life expectancy of a farm worker was 49 years because of the ignored working standard regulations, and this caused many workers to be injured or killed in preventable accidents. Latinx people also had to fight for education rights due to the segregation in schools between Latinx and white children. Latinx students followed a different grade structure that put them 2 to 3 years behind their white peers. The Texas Court of Appeals also ruled that school districts could use language and irregular attendance that was based on their agricultural work to segregate students and allowed this to continue. However, even after a lawsuit that prohibited schools from segregating based on ancestry, school segregation and de facto school segregation continued. The final struggle was Mexican repatriation, because during the Great Depression, Mexican immigrants were blamed for stealing American jobs. So Herbert Hoover and his administration announced a series of deportation programs, and they conducted raids in major cities. However, there was no federal law or act that permitted this mass deportation, but 2 million people were removed as part of the efforts in total. Although the federal government is the only agency with the power of deportation, local governments and private companies deported people as well. Another huge issue with these efforts was that there was no distinction between immigrants who arrived with legal documents, the children of immigrants that were US citizens themselves, and Mexican American families who had lived in the US since the Mexican War. So all of these people were deported, but some of them had never even stepped foot or lived in Mexico, but they were all sent to live there. Latinx people used lots of different strategies to fight for equal rights and freedoms. For example, labor strikes such as the Delano grape strike was one strategy that they used in their fight for civil rights. Cesar Chavez was a leader of the Latinx civil rights movement, and he headed the National Farm Workers Association, who joined Filipino farm workers in the Delano grape strike to demand better conditions, pay, and demand that they be able to form unions. Cesar Chavez also went on a hunger strike 3 years into the grape strike in order to refocus his protest on nonviolence. The strike ended up lasting for 5 years, and throughout this time, farm workers faced opposition from police officers, and the farm owners attempted to sabotage them multiple times. Eventually, the major farmers in the area agreed to raise the pay from 90 cents an hour to $1.80 per hour, and raise the pay per basket picked from 10 cents to 20 cents. So they eventually got a higher wage, and the farmers also agreed to contribute to a union health plan that would protect the farm workers from pesticides. The Latinx movement also went through the courts in order to fight against school segregation. The LAC and the American GI Forum, which was a group of Mexican American veterans, assisted in a lawsuit in which the federal district court prohibited schools from segregating based on Mexican ancestry. In 1955, these groups also initiated a lawsuit that protested putting Mexican children into separate classes for the first 2 grades, which required 4 years to complete. Eventually, in 1957, the practice of segregating schools based on language, ancestry, or attendance was finally outlawed. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers also called upon the public to boycott grape companies in order to support their fight for higher pay, better working conditions, and unions. Volunteers established boycott centers in big cities to publicize the boycott and the movement overall, and they picketed stores that sold non-union grapes. The civil rights movement created a new public understanding of racism, so this led millions of American consumers to stop buying grapes because they understood the implications for the Mexican farm workers. At the height of the boycott, 17 million Americans participated and refrained from buying grapes. Farm owners experienced a 20% decrease in profits as a result of the boycotts, and by 1970, the UFW had won contracts with most California grape growers. There are many comparisons between the civil rights leaders of the African American civil rights movement and the Latinx civil rights movement. Cesar Chavez admired Dr. Martin Luther King and his nonviolent approach and use of boycotts. He led peaceful demonstrations on farms and capitals that were similar to those led by Dr. King. Martin Luther King was also inspired by Chavez, and he sent multiple telegrams of support, and there are quotes from 2 of those telegrams below the picture. Other leaders from the Latinx movement were also compared to leaders from the civil rights movement, such as Lopez Tijerina, who was known as the Malcolm X of the Latinx movement, and he was the founder of the Federal Land Grant Alliance and fought for land reclamation. To conclude, the Latinx population suffered from segregation, discrimination, and they endured horrific working conditions on farms. They fought alongside the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement, and used similar strategies to fight for their freedoms and equal rights. Thanks for listening.